Okay, everyone, welcome to Lesson 5, the end of the war. This is the beginning of the end for the Axis, beginning with Japan. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans were actually ready to go on the offensive already. You have to understand our industrial might is just unimaginable. We had 19 aircraft carriers, which are the kings of the sea, in production within 6 months of Pearl Harbor. Now, one thing that had happened is the Americans had actually broken the code. You don't talk in plain language over the radio because your enemy can hear you, so you speak by code. And the Americans had actually broken the Japanese code, and we knew that they had a plan. Their plan was they were going to invade the island, little tiny island here of Midway, because they had an invasion here of the Aleutian Islands, which are the United States, part of Alaska. Japan actually in World War II invaded the United States. Attu and Kiska, these two islands here. And their idea was when that invasion began, the American aircraft carriers will start sailing up here to repel the invasion. Now, then the Japanese aircraft carrier force will come over here, bomb the base at Midway, destroying the airplanes so that their transport fleet could then land and conquer the island. And then Japan would land airplanes on the island, and as the American aircraft carriers came by, they would attack us and sink our fleet from Midway. That was the plan, and we knew it. So what happened was, basically, we waited here. We let them invade and didn't go after them, and we hit our aircraft carriers behind Midway. So when the carriers arrived here, now we had 3 aircraft carriers. They came with 5. And basically, when they arrived with the aircraft carriers, we were able to attack them, and we sunk all their aircraft carriers. We only lost 1. And from that moment on, the Japanese in the Pacific Ocean went on the defensive. They never had another offensive battle, another invasion for the rest of the war. And we're talking 1942 to 1945. The last 3 years was the United States getting closer and closer to Japan. And I'll go over that strategy right now. How we decided to get to Japan, because we had to, obviously all these islands, it was a 2-pronged approach. Our army will come from the south through Australia, our ally, and come up through the Philippine Islands to get closer to Japan, while our Navy with the Marines will invade the islands of the Middle Pacific. And through this 2-pronged approach, we will get closer and closer and closer to Japan, and finally, obviously, be able to invade them. The idea from jumping over the island, one island over the other, and skipping some, because once we skipped it, the island that we skipped, the Japanese soldiers were trapped on that island, and they have no communications and they have no supplies. So basically, they're living off whatever they can find to eat on the island. Actually, there was one Japanese soldier who was discovered in 1970s. 30 years after the war was over, living in the jungle of one of these islands, who did not know that the war was over for 30 years. They actually had to bring his old commander from Japan to speak to him and let him know and order him as his commander to surrender, because he thought that the people who were telling him the war was over were lying. This was 30 years later. That's how isolated these islands can be. In Europe now, the United States has to help fight against the Germans. Well, we can't invade Europe. And now, of course, the Soviets are saying, help us, because here we got all the Germans fighting us over here. If we invade France over here, then the Germans will have to fight on 2 fronts like World War I and lose. But the problem is Roosevelt was smart. He knew that if the Americans who haven't been fighting, were not experienced in war, invaded the best troops of Germany over here, they would slaughter us. But he knew that a lot of the troops that were helping the Germans in Africa were Italian troops, and the Italian troops were famous for not being really good soldiers. So our plan was first attack and liberate North Africa. The second part of the plan would be then to invade Sicily and then Italy and remove Italy from the alliance with Germany. And then from there, we will have access to the underbelly of Europe, and then obviously the invasion that the Russians are asking for too, once our soldiers have enough experience to actually fight these battle-hardened Germans up here. Battle of Sicily went as planned. Then we invaded Italy. Rome falls on June 5th of 1944. Now it's time for us to concentrate on the invasion of Europe itself. Now, Germany had built over these last few years what's known as the Atlantic Wall. It's barbed wire and concrete cannons and machine guns and millions of landmines. It was going to be a major problem for us to invade, yet that's what we had to do. Here are a few pictures of, like, these here are in high tide. The water is actually over these, and these would actually rip out the bottom of a landing craft if you land in high tide. And you want to land in high tide because when you land, you're closer to the shore and you don't have to run this far up a beach into machine gun fire. So you really don't want to land in low tide on an invasion. And of course, as I mentioned, they have these giant cannons and stuff like that. This is actually a picture that was only like 20 years old of the remains of the Atlantic Wall still that's there. Now, in order to make sure we had every advantage, we actually created a dummy army and put our number one top general, the one that the Germans feared the most, General Patton, in charge of this dummy army. And they had dummy tanks and trucks and radio communications. And what we do is we put the army right here in the part of the English Channel closest to Europe. And with all of this traffic and, the German spy planes looking over, seeing thousands of tanks and stuff, of course, they're convinced this is going to be the invasion place. But the problem is the invasion was so large. It actually was the largest amphibious invasion in history, that this was too small of an area for all these ships to go back and forth and not kill each other, crash into each other. So this is the invasion area right here, Normandy, France. D-Day is the invasion of Europe at Normandy, France. D-Day is the code word for it. So they needed more space for all the ships. So by thinking that this was the invasion, though, most of the German defenses are up here. Now, they have defenses here. Don't think, they're not protecting that, but the majority are over here. And we had actually done such a good job convincing the Germans that this was the invasion that when we finally invaded on June 6, 1944 here, Hitler truly believed that this was a fake and as a decoy to get him to move troops away so that the real invasion with Patton could come here. It actually took 4 or 5 days to convince him that this was fake and that this was real. So the art of deception, it actually worked very well. And on June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy, France, D-Day, took place. The largest armada of ships ever assembled. There were 5,000 airplanes also supporting all of these ships. And that allowed for the Allies, the British, the French, and the Americans specifically, and the Canadians, of course, to open up a second front against the Germans. Now the Germans know their days are numbered. There is actually, believe it or not, 13 assassination attempts against Hitler during his time. He's a lucky dude, man, I admit that. The one that's most famous and one that came the closest was the one which is Operation Valkyrie. You might have seen the movie with Tom Cruise, I don't know, where they tried to blow him up in one of his bunkers and nearly succeeded. The problem is they put the bomb on the wrong side of the table leg, and so when the bomb exploded, this table leg, which was thick oak, it deflected the explosion this way. Of course, now Hitler was actually deaf in his right ear and his right leg. He had a nasty limp for the remainder of his life, but still he survived the attempt. And then, of course, we liberate Paris as the Allies keep pouring in through Normandy into France and push closer and closer and closer. In the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad is basically a battle where the German army is stopped by the Soviet army, and it's a supremely bloody battle. And at the end, 400,000 soldiers will die, and another 110,000 soldiers will be taken prisoner to the Russians. And this is the first major defeat of the Germans. And of course, this will be something that the Germans cannot rebound from. And basically, you're coming to the end of the war. The last big offensive of Germany will actually be against the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge. That's where you see this big bulge here. The German army snuck through those Ardennes forests again, the same forest where they invaded France. Now they did it again. They're trying to get to the coast, to our supply lines, so they could get more gas for their armies too. And of course, it was the costliest battle in American history. But basically, we were able to hold them. And you can see with the Russians coming from this side, the British, French, Canadians, etc. coming on this side, and up here from the bottom, Germany finally collapsed. Now, the end of the war, some major events take place. First off, the Yalta Conference in 1945. where we are talking, the big three again, are talking about what to do at the end of the war. And we'll talk about that later on, the decisions that were made, because he will break his promise. Stalin will break his promise. Also, in March of 1945, Harry Truman will die. He literally, the last thing he said as a human being on this planet was, "I have a terrible headache." And then he fell over dead from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Thus, the Constitution dictates that if the president should die in office, the vice president, in this case, Vice President Harry Truman, should become the president of the United States, and he is sworn in on that same date as our new president. Also, Mussolini dies the same time. He tries to escape from Italy because Italy has surrendered, and he and his girlfriend are captured by the Italian people who were tired of the hardships and being forced into war, and they beat him and his girlfriend to death, and then they hang him here in public for everyone to see, the great Il Duce and what's left of him. April 25th, in 1945, the British, American, and the Soviet soldiers all meet and here and shake hands, and obviously Germany has been defeated. Now, there are some things that you need to know near the last year of the war about Hitler's secret weapons. The Buzz bomb rocket was the first kind of a rocket engine. And then, of course, the rocket here is Wernher von Braun. He actually is the father of the American space program. He's the one that got us to the moon. What happened was he was Hitler's top scientist for building rockets. And this is a rocket that flies faster than sound, and he bombs like London and within seconds. And, you know, people don't even know it's coming because it's faster than sound. You can't hear it. When the war was over, we kidnapped him and made him come back to the United States and work for us. As the, you know, it was a big race. All of the Allied countries, even the Soviets and Brits, tried to find as many of the scientists as possible to make their own. Hitler committed suicide. He did not want to be captured alive, so he married his longtime girlfriend, and then they took cyanide, and their assistant put a bullet in their head, and they were buried out and burned. Their bodies were burned. So on May 8th, Germany surrendered, and victory in Europe is celebrated by the world. And now that leaves Japan. Now, the Americans have been planning Operation Olympic for some time now. That is the invasion of Japan. But the problem is, it was estimated that there'll be about 1 million casualties of American soldiers in the invasion because the Japanese are putting pitchforks in everyone's, even children's hands, and Molotov cocktails and stuff. And every Japanese person on the islands is going to be trying to kill our soldiers. So we were expecting a lot. But luckily, Truman found out when he became president that we had been undergoing the most top secret project in American history, known as the Manhattan Project. That is the project to build a nuclear bomb. And by the time he became president, we had the first working prototype ready. So he basically contacted the Japanese, tells them we have a super weapon and they should surrender. And of course, the Japanese ignore it. So basically on August 6th, 1945, the Enola Gay drops one bomb, one airplane, one B-26, drops one bomb onto the city of Hiroshima, and it vanishes. And the Japanese still don't surrender. So on August 9th, one airplane flies over another city of Nagasaki and drops one bomb over that city, and that city vanished. Welcome to the nuclear age. Okay? And of course, after all of that, you can see that the Japanese no longer have fight left, and they surrender. These are just pictures of the aftermath of the nuclear explosions. And in August, 45 comes to the World War II comes to a close with the Japanese signing surrender on the battleship USS Missouri. Leaving problem, because the Soviet Union did not keep their promise and allow all of these countries here in Eastern Europe to become free and sovereign again. Actually, Joseph Stalin kept his armies here and refused to pull out. That's going to cause a new war called the Cold War, which we'll learn about shortly. The same thing happened over here. By the time Japan surrendered, the Russian armies had actually come down here and gotten halfway through the Korean Peninsula before the surrender. So the Russian armies were forced to stop here when Japan surrendered because now there were no longer a war, and the Americans were able to save this part of the peninsula from becoming communist. And because of the Russians staying here and creating their own puppet government,